or that's like what it is now. When we first started working on the game, we kind of planned to focus on some very different things than those. Like, for example, exploring huge environments, solving kind of strange and clever puzzles, and uncovering obscure secrets sort of locked away within the game, both within the world of the game and then also within the sort of meta text of the game. So that was a little more than 2 years ago that we started on this project with those goals in mind. And it's really changed a lot. I don't want to say it's like evolved necessarily, but it's sort of wandered or leaked out and shifted and turned into something very different from what we originally expected. But something that feels now a lot truer to the kind of story we wanted to tell, and also a lot truer just to Tomasa and Ben and I, and kind of what our process is, what our practice is, and what our backgrounds are. So we have a way of talking about that shift and how it's happened. And we say that we've moved away from designing puzzles, and we moved towards designing mysteries. And we're kind of borrowing that dichotomous pair, puzzles and mysteries, from this guy, Trevor Burton, who we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. So first, I wanted to tell you a little bit about where we're coming from in developing this game. So Tomasa and I have been working together for about 8 years, since about 2005. We met in art school and started collaborating mostly along with our good friend John Cates, who was a professor at the school, still is. And John he's an artist, and he's also an art historian. And a lot of the kind of center of his art historical research are these early video artists from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And particularly the work of this video artist, Phil Morton, and his collaborators who were working in Chicago, doing this really kind of like computer-centric video art. And that was super exciting for Tomasa and I. Tomasa and I, as people who have always only ever made art with computers, right? Or I guess Tomasa has a kind of more traditional illustration background too. But for my part, I've only ever made art with computers, making weird video games, websites, and experimental music mostly. So to kind of discover these early video artists who were working with computers as a sort of background for us was really inspirational. And I think that's sort of like where there's this recurring motif in Kentucky Route Zero of television and video technology being sort of magical. And I think that's kind of where that motif comes from, is from our sort of immersion in this early video art stuff. So Tomasa and John and I were doing a lot of software art projects, mostly stuff that lived in the web browsers. For example, we built this experimental chat room software that let you like dump in images and sounds and videos, and also write little macros that would dump in a bunch of crazy ASCII art text, making the chat room pretty illegible and pretty useless. And so we would use this as a way of doing these like hybridized sort of panel discussions and noise shows, along with a couple of our friends. Tomasa also plays in a band that's called Arcane Bolt, where they Tomasa and his partners like do custom-controlled microcontrollers that are attached directly to old CRT monitors to generate audio-video signals and feedback loops. And a few years ago, we worked with a big group of people to build this 20-foot-tall mountain of audio equipment in the middle of a big performance space called Lampo, which we called the Magic Matrix Mixer Mountain, and then used that for that sort of installation for a 2-hour-long performance where the audience was arranged in a ring around this huge, like I said, 20-foot-tall mountain of gear. So a lot of this work in installation and performance and software art that we've been doing uses a lot of the same like practical and aesthetic vocabularies as game development, right? You're making software that is reactive to somebody, like in an installation, it's reactive to a viewer. In the context of performance, it's like reactive to the performer, right? You're doing instrument building, and then in the context of a game, of course it's reactive to the player. And to the simulation. And it all runs in real time. That's also kind of crucial about all these different practices. What they have in common is that they all run in real time. And you can see some of these similarities between these different practices kind of permeating the boundaries between game and performance and installation. Really clearly in recent games like Proteus or Panoramical, you can see some of these borders start to collapse. Also, though, in early games like LSD Dream Emulator or hybridized game performance tools like some of the work of Tom Betts, like QQQ, for example, some of the work of Jody, like Untitled Game, for example, starts to collapse some of these like performative video game sort of like categories. And so Tomasa and I have been and still are super into video games, right? We've been following art games and indie games, and also, again, this kind of crossover stuff like Tom Betts and Jody. And we decided a few years ago that we were going to make a downloadable video game together. And we started with this kind of really half-baked idea that I had for a sort of Metroidvania platformer type game where you play this giant and he carries people around on his shoulders. So he can have 2 people with him at each time, and then these people confer different abilities to him depending on like what configuration of companions you have sitting on your shoulders. This was like a sort of a like I said, a Metroidvania thing, but also was sort of like a response to Mass Effect, which I was playing Mass Effect 2, and I was like, totally loved making all these awesome space friends, and then I was like, why do I have to kill these robots? I just want to make more space friends. And so we kind of talked about how could we come up with a game that was like literally just about going around making friends. And so Tomas and our friend John and I had recently done an art installation that was this kind of surrealist, cut-up remix of the classic text adventure game Colossal Cave Adventure by Will Crowther. And that game's set in Mammoth Cave in Kentucky. And I was spending a lot of time in Kentucky. My girlfriend's from there, and we go there to visit her family a lot. And so Tomas and I decided, we're going to keep working on this sort of Mammoth Cave idea and make this basically like Mammoth Cave Metroid game. So we had these locks and keys. Like I said, there are these characters that can sit on your shoulder, and they can basically open disguised and metaphorical doors for you, locks for you. And we were planning on constructing this world and telling this story based on kind of just arranging these sequences of locks and keys, arranging these patterns you'd move through the space, the same way that Super Metroid is designed, or some of the Castlevania games. And a lot of adventure games also, point-and-click adventure games, use puzzles in this way to kind of structure a player's progress through the story, but also as a way for the designer to come up with like how they're going to execute the process of telling the story, right? So they use puzzles in order to structure their thinking about how they're going to tell the story. And it's really helpful for both sides. Like for the player, the sort of like next goal is always really clear to you when you have a puzzle situation. Or in some cases, it's sort of unclear, but in a way that's kind of thematically consistent with the game. Like, for example, in The Curse of Monkey Island, the third Monkey Island game, there's this moment where you have to make a hangover cure for somebody. And the ingredients are really standard. Oh, this will be helpful information. The ingredients are really standard hangover cure ingredients. So like black pepper, an egg, and the hair of the dog that bit you. That's a really important one. And so you might think, like, oh, this guy's a pirate. Maybe I have to find some rum or something. What's the hair of the dog that bit him? But, of course, what you really need to do is trick a dog into biting you and then steal some of his fur. And so this is like an example of, this comes up all throughout the Monkey Island games. These are comedy games. And so they use puzzles as a kind of joke. And this sort of like unusualness, sort of unnaturalness of the puzzle is part of the joke they're doing, or it being a pun or something. And then if you look at another LucasArts game, The Dig, and that game is about archaeology or like anthropology, or I guess like xenopology. It's about aliens, right? And so you're kind of encountering this alien culture, and the puzzle behavior there is about doing this kind of archaeological work or xenopological work, right? So it's kind of consistent, thematically consistent there too. But Kentucky Route Zero is not a comedy game, and it's not a game about aliens. It's a game about real people and real people having hard times, right? So like economic downturn and austerity and stuff like that. There's a sort of magical or fantastical element to it, but that's really there as what Tomas and I think is an interesting strategy to explore the sort of inner lives of these characters and the sort of like impossibilities of these situations. So how could something like puzzles, the idea of puzzles, serve a real story about people and the challenges of being sort of economically and socially marginalized, particularly in the American Southwest, or South and Midwest, I mean? Well, so I mentioned this character, Gregory Trevorton, earlier, and the distinction that he makes between puzzles and mysteries. And if you haven't come across him before, Trevorton is this sort of think tank analyst. He works for the Rand Corporation, and he's really, global security and intelligence and spy stuff and stuff like that. That's sort of like his domain. And that's the context in which he's talking about puzzles and mysteries, or these like military situations, these like espionage situations. We're being pretty carefree or playful in borrowing that terminology. We're not talking about military situations. So he says that a puzzle is something that you could solve if only you had all the information, right? And a mystery is a mystery is more like a situation where you have too much information, you don't know what's relevant, and in fact, you have no guarantee that any of it is relevant, and you have no guarantee that a solution exists to the problem at all. And the examples he uses are mostly military, like I said. He says the Cold War was a puzzle. The United States, there was one right answer about how many warheads the Soviet Union had, right? And the United States is gathering information in order to arrive at that answer. Finding Osama bin Laden was a puzzle because there's one specific place where Osama bin Laden was. Again, like I said, these are all military examples. That's not exactly how we're using these terms. He also says the hijackers of September 11th didn't arrive at that plan because they were aviation buffs. They arrived at that plan because they identified gaps in our aviation defense. And then the most important way that he defines this, he says, a mystery cannot be answered. It can only be framed. So the best that we can hope to do with a mystery is to develop good filters and kind of figure out where to look and what to do with what we see there. So this is frustrating, especially for somebody, again, like I said, in the domain of global security or intelligence or something. He also says that puzzles are clearly more satisfying, but the world increasingly offers us mysteries. And that's a statement that we agree with. And as designers who are making a game about contemporary life, we've found that this approach of thinking about mysteries was more natural and more sort of thematically consistent to the story than was this idea of designing puzzles. And our mysteries, the mysteries that we're concerned with in this game are things like credit default swaps and like other sort of precariously complicated devices of finance that find their expression in things like payday loans, other sort of predatory lending behavior, subprime mortgages, health insurance, even just healthcare. We often would like to think that healthcare is a puzzle, like trying to find a specific cure, but in fact, we're finding more and more that our health is this really complicated interaction, or group of interactions between genetics and behavior and habits. And so we didn't set out to shift our thinking from puzzles to mysteries, but as we began to take on those issues that I'm talking about there, our values kind of changed to match these issues. So what does this mean practically for our design process? Well, one big change in abandoning puzzles was that we were unmoored from this approach to pacing, right, to laying out the player's navigation through the game over a period of time. We couldn't use this sequence of puzzles anymore to control their progress through the story, either for the player or for us as a way of constructing it. So we had to rely on other pacing techniques, and this is where we kind of came back to this experimental film and video art that we'd been immersed in for so long prior to starting work on the game. Tomas and I are always having conversations about theater and film, and I'll get into our use of theater a little bit more in a moment, but first I wanted to talk about some of the cinematic techniques we rely on and some of our points of reference there. So the filmmakers that are always inevitably coming up for us when we sit down to talk about how to build the game are Andrei Tarkovsky, Werner Herzog, David Lynch, Chris Marker, and Akira Kurosawa. And these are all filmmakers who are masters of pacing, and also who are very bold in their use of sort of slowness and stillness. And these are qualities that we're sort of abstracting from their work and putting into our work. Let's see. Sorry. So in KRZ, we sort of discarded this ready-made pacing structure of puzzles and carefully arranged locks and keys. So we modulate instead the player's ability to move through the space, right? So when you start the game, you can run around, you can climb, you can jump. Very quickly, the main character becomes injured, and he can no longer move so quickly. He's riding around in this electric tram, and then he's sort of limping along. So we use these like modulations in the player's ability to move around, and also messing with some of the player's expectations. So they're taught in the very first scene that they can jump, and then they can never jump again. We also treat the dialogue in a very specific and deliberate way. And one place that we look at for inspiration in the dialogue is theater, mostly American tragic theater from the middle of the 20th century. For example, Death of a Salesman from 1949. And so we try to write the dialogue in order that it always sort of feels linear, and that might seem kind of counterintuitive, given the sort of consensus that games are really good at nonlinearity, which is true. But for us, this again is a matter of pacing. So the dialogue, in fact, is branching, but it always sort of has the feeling that it's moving forward at a steady pace, right? And this is something, as I said, we look at the way that pacing unfolds during conversations, mostly in this like American mid-century tragic theater. So we're really like embracing the quality of linearity, not necessarily the function of linearity. It's a like kind of a tricky way to write, to like always give that impression that things are always moving forward. You can't do this sort of traditional hub and spoke like RPG approach to dialogue where you have this list of options that you keep going back to and branching up. That's not really how conversations work most of the time. So it's a little, it's kind of weird territory to write for, but it takes a lot of time. But it's been really rewarding for us, and it's something that we're sticking to. And you can see some of our like sort of formal experimentations even in Act 1 with the way that this dialogue behaves, like switching speaker in the middle of a conversation or something, or asking the player to respond to something that they couldn't possibly know about, right? Asking the player to define this character before they have any investment in this character. These are all strategies that we're using for one thing as writing techniques, but also to keep the player off balance so that the player doesn't feel at any time like they're behaving strategically. So a lot of games offer players great chances to be strategists, right? But this game, and to be powerful strategists, this game, Kentucky Road Zero, is about disempowered people, and it's about not having that option of sort of behaving strategically. And so again, it's this sort of thematic consistency that we're going for, and it expresses itself in this kind of formal experimentation with the dialogue and stuff. Let's see. So the scene that we saw a second ago, let me scroll back here. This scene from the 1985 adaptation of Death of a Salesman by Schlendorf, the sort of new German cinema filmmaker. This is a really, sorry, it's actually a little bit earlier. This is a really brilliant scene in the film it's a TV adaptation that merges this theatrical logic about this one set. Everything's happening on this one set. It merges that with this cinematic logic about cuts and lighting changes happening off screen, right? So Willy Loman is having a fugue. He's in this sort of senile reverie, remembering a time when he was a successful salesman and well-liked, and his son Biff was captain of the football team. And somewhere during his reverie, we just sort of like tumble into a sort of memory of this space. And the lighting changes and it's daytime. But crucially, we're in the same building. They've made a cut, right? And this is crucial because everything in Death of a Salesman happens in this one home. And there's this thing about, Willy Loman's wife, Linda, is trying to pay off the home. And, it ends with Willy Loman's suicide. And then his wife says, I made the last payment on the house today. We're free. This is like this, sort of very important theme that Schlendorf is picking up on and using these modulations in space and using these like confusions in theatrical technique and cinematic technique. So yeah, again, these are the kind of artists and filmmakers that we're looking at and writers that we're looking at. And we try to make use of techniques like that revelation. When we have a space to reveal, we make the revelation of that space into a project, right? So the way that in Act 1, the gas station sort of reveals itself as soon as the lights come on, as soon as the lights change levels. And similarly, there's in the second scene of Act 1, there's this farmhouse, and it's this long tracking shot that just zooms all the way into the farmhouse. The camera only moves in sort of Z space, right? And this, if you are an experimental film buff, you may recognize this technique from Michael Snow's film Wavelength, which is a sort of structuralist experimental film from, I think, 60s, I believe. And it's just a one long 43-minute zoom in from one side of a room to another. And I think, these structuralist filmmakers have a lot to teach game designers, particularly game designers who sort of subscribe to the ideology and set of concerns and techniques of experimental game design, right? These are structuralist filmmakers were all about finding some small behavior that's peculiar to the camera, and then sort of just exploring all the different iterations of that behavior, right? So this sounds a lot like experimental game design, the way that Steve Swink, for example, has defined it in the past. I realize this talk has been a little bit sprawling, and I'm okay with that. I think in the spirit of mystery, I'd rather not try to sum anything up too quickly, but I'm definitely happy to take questions now.